Welcome to this explainer on Ted Turner. Get ready, because we're about to dive into what is honestly a high-stakes thriller of a life story. We're talking bold gambles, fierce rivalries, and the profound legacy of a man who constantly, and I mean constantly, risked absolutely everything to challenge the status quo. Today, we're going to map out the incredible rise, the devastating setbacks, and the lasting global impact of one of modern history's most fascinating and unpredictable figures. Let's kick things off with a quote from his former wife, Jane Fonda. She pretty much nailed it when she called him a gloriously handsome, deeply romantic, swashbuckling pirate. I mean, how's that for a description, right? It perfectly frames his life as this epic voyage. Turner wasn't your traditional buttoned-up businessman. He was an absolute maverick, sailing directly against the wind of these established corporate giants, relying on sheer willpower and a really brilliant strategic mind. So part one, the swashbuckling pirate. Let's look behind that persona. Now, to really understand the pirates, we first have to look at the deeply hidden pain that fueled his relentless drive. You see, the press loved calling him Captain Outrageous or the Mouth of the South. He was the brash guy who bought the Atlanta Braves and, at one point, drunkenly challenged Rupert Murdoch to a literal fistfight. But behind all that loud bravado was a youth marked by intense trauma. He faced physical abuse from a very demanding father who suffered from bipolar disorder. And after being expelled from Brown University, twice actually, the ultimate blow came in 1963 when his father committed suicide. At just 24 years old, Turner was suddenly left in charge of his father's heavily indebted billboard business. Imagine taking that on at 24 years old. That intense pressure cooker is what truly drove his aggressive, totally fearless approach to business. Moving on to Section 2, slaying the media monopolies. So he takes that billboard money and sets his sights squarely on television. And you really have to look at the breakneck speed at which Turner disrupted the entire broadcast industry. In 1970, completely against his board's advice, he literally mortgaged his house to buy a failing Atlanta UHF station that was bleeding $50,000 every single month. But by 1976, he recognized the crazy potential of new technology. He used an RCA satellite to beam his local Atlanta signal nationwide. He basically created the very first superstation, forcing massive, established networks to suddenly compete with his independent programming. And then comes the crown jewel in 1980, the launch of CNN, the world's first 24-hour news network. Without even fully realizing it, he essentially invented the modern media landscape we all consume today. Now, you have to remember, when CNN launched, the established networks totally laughed at it. They mocked it as chicken noodle news because of its tiny budget and, those early technical glitches. But Turner was a visionary. He hired promising up-and-comers to get in on the ground floor. Dave Walker and Lois Hart anchored the very first newscast. He brought on veteran Daniel Shore to give the network instant journalistic credibility. And this whole bold experiment reached a massive, dramatic climax during the 1991 Persian Gulf War. Bernard Shaw, Peter Arnett, and John Holloman became absolute legends as the Baghdad Three. They broadcast live from a hotel balcony in Iraq, scooping official military announcements by 27 minutes. In that single, historic moment, CNN officially became the global news of record. Which brings us to Section 3, the billion-dollar MGM gamble. Here's the thing. After inventing the 24-hour news cycle, Turner hits this massive existential crisis. He had all these channels, right? But he desperately needed content to actually fill them. So in 1985, he makes an incredibly audacious move to avoid the skyrocketing licensing fees from Hollywood. He accumulates a staggering $2 billion in junk bond debt to buy MGM. And that debt was immediately crushing. I mean, within months, just to survive and avoid total bankruptcy, he had to sell the MGM production arm and the studio lot right back to the very people he bought it from. But then comes his absolute genius survival play. He walked away with the real price. He retained the massive MGM film library, keeping 3,650 classic titles, including heavy hitters like The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind. So what does he do with those 3,650 titles? Well, he completely changes the entertainment landscape. He uses this massive library to launch the Cartoon Network in 1992, which, by the way, sparked an entire animation renaissance in the 90s, and then Turner Classic Movies in 1994. By presenting these films uncut and commercial-free, he ultimately earned immense praise for preserving fragile historic films. However, it definitely wasn't without controversy. To make some of the older films more marketable for TV, Turner began colorizing black and white classics, and this drew fierce backlash. Hollywood legend Orson Welles famously told a colleague to prevent Turner from coloring my movie with his crayons. Okay, section 4, love and the great setback. As we hit the turn of the millennium, Turner's life, both personal and professional, reaches its absolute highest peaks and, frankly, its most devastating valleys. Turner and Jane Fonda married in 1991, and they were the ultimate 90s power couple. But underneath it all, they were moving in fundamentally different directions. Turner was notoriously restless. He really had no belief in permanency, he was constantly traveling across his vast landholdings, and he fiercely detested organized religion. Fonda, on the other hand, was seeking a slower pace, which she called vertical growth, and her conversion to Christianity in the late 90s deeply fractured their union. They ended up divorcing in 2001. Yet, amazingly enough, they've remained incredibly close, with Fonda later affectionately calling him her favorite ex-husband who helped her truly believe in herself. But right at the exact same time his marriage is ending, Turner faces his greatest professional tragedy. We are talking $7 to $8 billion. Poof! Wiped out. In 2001, Turner's empire merged in the catastrophic AOL-Time Warner deal. Turner himself later called it the biggest mistake in corporate history. The resulting stock collapse absolutely decimated this staggering amount of his personal wealth. And even worse, it resulted in him being completely removed from active management of the very media empire he had built from scratch. This leads us to Section 5, a legacy of conservation. Now, he didn't just fade away after all that. Instead, he pivots entirely away from corporate media to focus on saving the planet. In 1997, he stunned the globe with just the sheer audacity of this move. He pledged $1 billion of his own money to the United Nations. This historic pledge led directly to the creation of the UN Foundation. He basically takes that exact same swashbuckling spirit and applies it to eco-stewardship. He launched everything from the Captain Planet cartoon back in 1990 to teach kids to be eco-heroes, to the Turner Endangered Species Fund. He co-founded the Nuclear Threat Initiative to reduce the risk of weapons of mass destruction, and he even co-founded the restaurant chain Ted's Montana Grill. And the reason for the restaurant, it was specifically to promote the consumption of bison, which, counterintuitively, acts as a conservation tool to increase their overall population by creating a market for them. And speaking of conservation, get this. He becomes one of America's largest private landowners, stewarding roughly 2 million acres of land. To put that into perspective, that is an area roughly the size of Yellowstone National Park. On that vast land, he built a massive private herd of approximately 51,000 bison. Through this monumental investment in land and livestock, Turner is widely credited with successfully helping bring the American bison back from the absolute brink of extinction. Then, in 2018, Turner revealed he was facing his final battle, a diagnosis of Lewy body dementia, which is a progressive brain disorder. But completely true to form, despite his declining health, he maintained his soaring sense of humor. He firmly stated in his final years that true happiness doesn't come from building massive corporate empires or hoarding wealth. It comes from family, friends, and your deep personal relationships. Which brings us to the end. Ted Turner chose just 6 words for his tombstone. I have nothing more to say. And honestly, he left it all on the field. He built networks, challenged monopolies, lost billions, saved species, and completely changed the way the world receives its news. So it leaves us with one really provocative question. In today's era of risk-averse, highly consolidated, profit-focused corporate monopolies, will we ever see another swashbuckling pirate quite like Ted Turner?